Marcus Bennett thought doing the right thing would be simple. As a skilled engineer in Riverside, he refused his director's order to build beyond legal limits and use unsafe materials. When he reported the corruption, he was framed, accused of fraud, pushed into court, labeled guilty. But Marcus didn't run. Using his technical knowledge, recordings, and proof of tampered files, he exposed the real scheme. The truth stood firm. Integrity won. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Riverside, Colorado woke beneath a pale, silver sky, the early autumn air cool and thin as it rolled down from the Rockies. A light wind moved through the cottonwood trees lining the riverbanks, carrying the scent of dust and distant pine. The city was still quiet at 6:30 a.m., traffic only beginning to hum along the main roads. Beyond downtown's modest skyline, cranes and steel frames cut sharp angles against the morning light, evidence of growth, ambition, and risk. Marcus Bennett stood at the edge of one such structure. At 32, Marcus was tall, just over 6 feet, with a lean, athletic build shaped by years of fieldwork rather than gym mirrors. His deep brown skin carried faint sunlines from long hours outdoors. His hair was cropped short, neat and practical. His face held a strong jaw and focused dark eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. He dressed simply. Navy work shirt, reflective safety vest, heavy boots dusted with concrete powder. To strangers, he appeared calm, even reserved. But beneath that stillness lived a meticulous mind and a stubborn moral core. Marcus was not loud. He was precise. He had earned his civil engineering degree at night while working full-time as a junior inspector. He had passed every licensing exam on his first attempt. He had built a reputation at Redwood Development as someone who solved problems without cutting corners. On site, workers trusted him because he spoke plainly. He listened before he ordered. He corrected mistakes without humiliation. He believed buildings had memory. If you cheated a foundation, it would remember. Behind him rose the skeletal frame of the Riverside Civic Expansion Project, a mixed-use development bordering a protected wetland zone. The project was ambitious: retail, apartments, underground parking. It would reshape this part of the city. It would also test the limits of engineering and law. Marcus opened his tablet and reviewed the permit lines again. 12 feet. That was the discrepancy. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind him. Richard Coleman approached with measured confidence. At 54, Richard was broad-shouldered and thick around the middle, his expensive tailored coat stretched slightly at the buttons. His pale skin had reddened permanently from decades of golf courses and business lunches. His thinning gray hair was combed carefully back, his blue eyes sharp and calculating. Richard smiled easily in public. He was known for shaking hands firmly and speaking about community growth. But beneath that polished surface lived relentless ambition. He valued efficiency. He valued profit. He believed compromise was weakness. "Morning, Marcus," Richard said, voice smooth as polished steel. "Progress looks good." Marcus nodded. "Framing is on schedule." Richard studied the site, then lowered his voice. "We need to accelerate returns. The board wants margins tightened." Marcus didn't respond immediately. A second man joined them, Daniel Harper. Daniel was 38, average height with a solid build softened by office hours. His sandy blonde hair was neatly parted, and he wore rectangular glasses that gave him a thoughtful appearance. But his green eyes carried a restless edge. Daniel had once been idealistic, fresh out of graduate school. Over time, promotions and bonuses had reshaped his priorities. He admired Richard's decisiveness. He envied it. Daniel held a folder. "We've revised the internal site plan," Daniel said. "Small adjustments, nothing dramatic." Marcus accepted the folder. The new layout extended the foundation beyond permitted boundaries, 12 feet into a buffer zone designed to protect wetland runoff. The steel reinforcement grade had also been quietly downgraded. On paper, the change seemed subtle. In practice, it altered drainage flow and long-term soil stability. Marcus flipped through the pages carefully. "The soil study doesn't support this extension," he said calmly. "If we shift load distribution outward, we increase pressure on the retention line." Richard sighed softly. "You're overthinking it." Marcus looked up. "Water doesn't negotiate," he replied. For a brief moment, silence settled between them. Richard's smile thinned. "Everyone in this industry makes adjustments," he said. "It's how projects survive." Marcus understood the unspoken truth. Adjust or be replaced. That evening, Riverside glowed amber under streetlights as temperatures dipped. Marcus's home sat in a modest residential neighborhood. Small yards, quiet sidewalks, children's bicycles leaning against fences. Inside, warmth replaced the chill. Olivia Bennett stood at the kitchen counter, grading math worksheets. She was 29, tall and slender with caramel-brown skin and expressive hazel-brown eyes that softened when she smiled. Her natural curls were pulled back loosely, and she wore comfortable maternity clothes that highlighted her 7-month pregnancy. Olivia taught 3rd grade at a local elementary school. She believed in structure, fairness, and patience. Years earlier, she had lost her younger brother in a car accident caused by reckless driving. Since then, she had developed a deep intolerance for irresponsibility. Safety mattered to her, not abstractly but personally. She looked up as Marcus entered. "You're quiet," she said gently. Marcus loosened his boots and sat at the table. "They want to push the foundation beyond the permit," he said. "Reduce material grade." Olivia paused. "Is it safe?" Marcus hesitated. "Not long term." Olivia walked to him, resting a hand over her stomach. The unborn child shifted beneath her palm. "Then it's not an option," she said. Marcus admired her clarity, but clarity did not erase consequence. Later that night, he stepped onto the small back porch. The air was cold now. He leaned against the railing and closed his eyes. He thought of his father. Leonard Bennett had been a construction laborer in Georgia for 30 years. Tall, broad, with dark weathered skin and powerful hands scarred by rebar and rope burns. Leonard spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He had worked double shifts to send Marcus to school. He had once refused to participate in a rushed pour that ignored curing time. He lost that job. He never regretted it. "Concrete can be hard," Leonard had told his son once, "but your conscience has to be harder." Marcus felt the memory settle like steady ground beneath him. The next morning at the site, Marcus requested a drainage reassessment meeting. Workers moved around them, welders sparking arcs of white-blue light, foremen shouting measurements, forklifts reversing with sharp beeps. Emily Ross stood near the trailer office. Emily was 24, slight in frame with fair skin dusted in freckles and chestnut hair tied in a tight ponytail. Her brown eyes were observant, cautious. Fresh from engineering school, she admired Marcus's discipline. She believed in rules. Perhaps too much. It was her first corporate job, and she was still learning where theory collided with pressure. When Marcus passed, she stepped closer. "I reviewed the revision file," she whispered. "It was edited late, after you logged out." Marcus stopped. "Who accessed it?" "I don't know," she said, voice tight. "But the metadata changed." Marcus nodded once. "Thank you." He walked into the trailer. Inside, Richard and Daniel waited. "I can't approve this," Marcus said directly. Richard's jaw tightened. "You're being dramatic." "The wetland buffer exists for a reason." Daniel shifted in his seat. "It's 12 feet." "It's 12 feet of accountability," Marcus replied. Richard leaned back. "You're talented, Marcus. Don't make yourself difficult." The room felt smaller. Marcus understood something then. This was no longer about engineering. It was about obedience. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in over Riverside, darkening the sight. Wind picked up, rattling loose tarps and sending dust spiraling. Marcus stood again at the permit line marked by wooden stakes. He imagined the future. Heavy rains, saturated soil, pressure building silently beneath concrete. He imagined neighboring homes dealing with flooding. He imagined reading about failure in a report stamped with his signature. He felt the weight of two worlds pressing in. One world said, "Stay quiet." One world said, "Stand firm." Behind him, Richard's truck engine started. The sound lingered. Marcus looked at the 12-foot extension one last time. And for the first time since joining Redwood Development, he felt the ground beneath him shift, not physically, but morally. The permit line was no longer just paint on paper. It was a boundary inside him, and he was standing directly on it. The wind over Riverside carried a sharper edge that week, colder than the calendar suggested. Clouds moved low across the foothills, pressing the city into a muted gray. At the construction site, the steel frame groaned faintly as temperatures shifted overnight, expansion and contraction whispering through the structure. Marcus Bennett stood alone near the marked boundary line again, hands in his jacket pockets, watching workers move with routine confidence, unaware of the fracture forming behind closed doors. The permit line no longer looked like paint and stakes. It looked like a fork in the road. Marcus had narrowed his options to two: leave quietly, protect his record, start somewhere new. Or stay, comply, and gamble everything, license, freedom, reputation, on the assumption that nothing would collapse. He knew enough about structures to understand this truth. Failure rarely announced itself immediately. It accumulated pressure. Inside the temporary site office, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Daniel Harper sat at the folding desk, scrolling through projected revenue spreadsheets. He looked tired but excited, the kind of tension that comes from proximity to reward. Daniel had grown up middle class in suburban Ohio, the son of a small business owner who went bankrupt during the 2008 recession. That collapse had shaped him deeply. He feared instability more than wrongdoing. Money, to Daniel, meant insulation from humiliation. Marcus closed the door behind him. "We need to talk," Marcus said. Daniel rubbed his eyes and leaned back. "If this is about the 12 feet again, it's not just 12 feet. Daniel stood, pacing once across the cramped trailer. He was average height, but he carried himself with restless motion, as if still chasing something ahead of him. "You're thinking like a textbook. This is business. We shift margins, we adjust scope, we protect profit. Investors expect growth. And residents expect safety," Marcus replied evenly. Daniel stopped pacing. "Richard is offering performance bonuses tied to this project. Equity shares if we deliver under budget. That's life-changing, Marcus." Marcus studied him carefully. "At what cost?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. His silence said enough. When Marcus left the trailer, he saw Emily Ross standing near the equipment shed. She pretended to review a clipboard, but glanced toward him anxiously. Emily's frame looked smaller in the oversized safety jacket she wore. Her movements were cautious, precise. She had graduated at the top of her class, the first engineer in her family. Her father was a mechanic in Denver, her mother a nurse. She had been raised to believe that education guaranteed fairness. Corporate reality was dismantling that belief quietly. She stepped closer. "I double-checked the CAD files last night," she said softly. "The soil compression model was altered. Someone reduced the saturation coefficient." Marcus nodded. "Keep a copy." Her eyes widened. "If they find out I saved files—" "I won't let that happen," Marcus said, though he knew protection had limits. Emily swallowed. "I just wanted to design buildings that last." "So did I," Marcus replied. That evening, Marcus drove home under a sky streaked with fading orange and steel blue. Riverside's quiet streets felt unchanged. Children riding bikes, neighbors watering lawns. The normalcy unsettled him. Inside, Olivia Bennett was sitting on the couch, ankles slightly swollen, a blanket over her legs. The television played softly in the background, but her attention was on Marcus the moment he walked in. She had always been perceptive. It was one of the qualities that made her an exceptional teacher. Children trusted her because she saw beyond behavior into cause. "You're not sleeping," she said without accusation. Marcus loosened his collar. "I'm thinking." "That's not the same as resting." He sat beside her. She studied his face carefully. "You're weighing something heavy." Marcus exhaled slowly. "If I walk away, they'll do it anyway. If I stay and refuse, I become the problem." Olivia leaned back against the cushions. Years ago, when her brother died in a preventable accident caused by a distracted contractor, she had learned how negligence rippled outward. It had shaped her intolerance for shortcuts. Which choice lets you look at our child without explaining why you stayed silent? She asked gently. The question lingered long after she went to bed. Marcus moved to the kitchen table, opened his laptop, and began reviewing archived permits, drainage reports, soil assessments. He downloaded timestamp logs. He printed copies of approved design versions. He compared them line by line with the revised drafts. He wasn't building a case yet. He was building insurance. Across town, another thread was quietly forming. Samuel Grant sat in a dim office cluttered with folders and outdated filing cabinets. At 45, Samuel had the gaunt frame of someone who forgot to eat when working. His dark hair was streaked prematurely gray, his brown eyes alert and skeptical. He had once worked for a larger Denver paper but left after refusing to soften an investigative piece. Integrity had cost him promotion, but it had given him independence. Now he ran a small local investigative column in Riverside. He was reviewing public records on redwood development. 3 minor environmental citations from 5 years ago caught his attention. Nothing catastrophic. But patterns mattered to Samuel. He tapped a pen against his desk and circled the company name again. Back at Redwood headquarters the following morning, Richard Coleman called Marcus into the main office. The building's glass facade reflected the pale sky, polished and corporate. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and money. Richard stood behind his desk, hands clasped loosely. "I hear you're still hesitating." "I'm following the approved permit," Marcus replied. Richard walked around the desk slowly, posture relaxed but voice tightening. "This industry doesn't reward rigidity. It rewards adaptability." Marcus met his gaze. "There's a difference between adapting and falsifying." Richard's smile disappeared. "You're talented, but talent is replaceable." The message was clear. Later that afternoon, Daniel approached Marcus in the parking lot. His expression had shifted, less confident, more defensive. "You're forcing this into a moral drama," Daniel said quietly. "It's numbers. It's scale. Nobody's going to prison over drainage adjustments." Marcus looked at him steadily. "You don't know that." Daniel hesitated, then added, "You could just sign. No one would question you." Marcus understood the implication. His signature carried credibility. That night he lay awake listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft rhythm of Olivia's breathing beside him. His mind replayed the options again and again. Leave quietly, or stay and resist. He rose before dawn and stepped onto the porch. The sky was just beginning to lighten. He felt the cool air fill his lungs. He thought of his father's hands. He thought of Olivia's question. He thought of 12 feet of altered earth. By the time the sun crested the distant hills, Marcus had made one decision. Not about quitting or complying, but about preparation. If this became a storm, he would not stand empty-handed. At the site that day, he began quietly documenting everything. He saved backup copies of approved models to an encrypted drive. He photographed material deliveries. He logged conversations in a private notebook. He requested written clarification for every verbal instruction. Emily noticed the shift. She mirrored it carefully, double-checking data, archiving files discreetly. Fear flickered in her movements, but so did resolve. Daniel watched Marcus from a distance, uncertainty creeping into his posture. He wanted profit. He also wanted protection. Richard, meanwhile, increased pressure through meetings and subtle remarks about loyalty and team cohesion. "Everyone does this," he repeated. "This is how the industry works." Marcus no longer argued. He simply refused to sign. As evening fell over Riverside once more, the construction site lights blinked on against the darkening sky. Workers clocked out. Engines started, dust settled. Marcus remained for a moment longer, standing at the edge of the foundation trench. Two paths remained before him, equally costly in different ways. He had not yet chosen which to take, but he had chosen not to be unprepared. And sometimes the choice no one sees is the one that shapes everything that follows. The wind over Riverside no longer felt seasonal. It felt like warning. By midweek, low clouds pressed against the foothills, heavy and unmoving, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. At the construction site, the steel frame loomed darker against the gray horizon. Workers continued their routines, cutting, welding, measuring, unaware that something far more fragile than concrete was cracking behind office doors. Marcus Bennett had not changed his position. He still refused to approve the altered plans. But something had changed in the air around him. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Emails grew shorter. Meetings became colder. Inside the main Redwood Development office, Richard Coleman stood near the window overlooking the site. He did not turn when Marcus entered. His broad silhouette filled the frame of glass and steel. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but sharpened at the edges. "You're creating instability," Richard said quietly. Marcus stood upright, hands relaxed at his sides. "I'm following the permit." Richard turned slowly. His pale face had lost its practiced warmth. "If you escalate this beyond the company, you won't just lose this project, you'll lose credibility. Do you understand how small this industry is?" Marcus held his gaze. "I understand accountability." Richard stepped closer. He smelled faintly of cologne and polished leather. Careers end quietly all the time. People get labeled difficult. They stop getting calls. They disappear. The word lingered. Disappear. Marcus did not flinch, but he felt the weight of it. Later that afternoon, Daniel Harper approached him in the empty parking lot. Daniel's shoulders were tense. His tie loosened as if he had been arguing internally for hours. His once eager expression had hardened into defensiveness. "You're pushing him," Daniel said in a low voice. "Richard doesn't like being cornered." "I'm not cornering anyone," Marcus replied. "I'm refusing to sign something illegal." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think you're the hero here? You think this ends well for you?" Marcus studied him carefully. "Does it end well for anyone if we ignore the risk?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I do," Marcus said. "That's the problem." Daniel's voice dropped further. "If you make this public, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose your standing. People will remember you as the engineer who caused a corporate investigation. You might not work in this state again." The threat was no longer subtle. It was professional exile. Marcus drove home under gathering rain clouds. The first drops hit his windshield just as he turned into his neighborhood. Inside, Olivia Bennett sat at the dining table with a stack of lesson plans. Her posture had grown heavier as her pregnancy advanced, but her expression remained steady. She looked up immediately when he entered, sensing the shift before he spoke. "They're escalating," Marcus said. Olivia folded her hands slowly. "How?" "Not directly, but clearly." She rose carefully and walked toward him. Despite her slender frame, she carried herself with quiet strength. Years of teaching had taught her how to de-escalate conflict, how to stand firm without raising her voice. Losing her brother years earlier had carved a deep awareness of consequences into her spirit. She did not fear conflict, she feared negligence. "Are you safe?" she asked plainly. Marcus hesitated for the first time. "I don't know." Olivia inhaled slowly. "I won't tell you to stop. I married you because you don't bend easily, but I need you careful, not reckless." Marcus nodded. "I'm documenting everything." "Good," she said. "Truth doesn't protect you if you don't preserve it." That night, while rain tapped against the windows, Marcus reviewed his encrypted files. He had archived drainage models, soil compression data, revised procurement forms. He began adding timestamps to personal notes, conversations, phrases, warnings. Across town, in his dimly lit office, Samuel Grant leaned back in his chair, staring at a municipal fine from 5 years earlier. Redwood Development had paid a modest administrative penalty for non-compliant grading near protected runoff. The language was vague. The fine was small, but Samuel understood patterns. He circled the date and muttered to himself, "They've done this before." Samuel's thin fingers tapped his keyboard as he searched for additional complaints. His instincts told him this wasn't an isolated oversight. The next morning at the site, Emily Ross approached Marcus cautiously. Her normally neat ponytail looked slightly disheveled, and dark circles framed her observant brown eyes. She had barely slept. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered. In her hand was a flash drive. "What is it?" Marcus asked quietly. "Internal emails," she said. "Procurement threads. Richard and Daniel discussing liability distribution. They're planning fallback narratives." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Why risk this?" he asked. Emily's voice trembled, but her gaze remained steady. "Because I didn't study engineering to help someone cheat environmental limits." Marcus took the drive carefully. "No one knows you gave me this." She shook her head. "Not yet." He nodded once. "You did the right thing." But as she walked away, he understood that doing the right thing had a cost, and Emily had just volunteered to share it. Later that afternoon, Richard called a closed-door meeting. Daniel sat stiffly beside him. "This resistance ends now," Richard said flatly. "We are moving forward with the adjusted scope." Marcus responded calmly, "I will not approve it." Richard's eyes hardened completely. "Then understand something clearly. If this becomes external, if regulators start asking questions, we will not shield you. In fact, your prior objections could be interpreted as complicity. You've been part of every stage of this project." Marcus absorbed the implication. They were laying groundwork. Daniel avoided his gaze. For the first time, Marcus recognized the depth of the danger. This was no longer simply about professional disagreement. It was about positioning, narrative, blame. He drove, not home, but downtown. The municipal building stood under a dim sky, rain streaking its stone facade. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Marcus approached the regulatory compliance desk. Behind it sat a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a low bun. Her nameplate read, Linda Chavez. She wore reading glasses low on her nose and carried herself with the weary patience of someone who had processed years of complaints and paperwork. "How can I help you?" she asked. Marcus inhaled slowly. "I'd like to report potential permit violations related to the Riverside Civic Expansion Project." Linda's expression shifted subtly, alert, professional. "Do you have documentation?" "Yes." He placed a folder on the counter. As she reviewed the first few pages, Marcus felt something unexpected. Not fear, not relief, but inevitability. The line had been crossed. Outside, rain continued to fall steadily over Riverside. Marcus stepped back into the gray afternoon, knowing something fundamental had changed. He had chosen not to remain silent. And whether the consequences would be professional, personal, or both, there was no returning to neutrality. The threat had been spoken. Now the response had begun. The rain over Riverside did not stop for 3 days. It came down steady and cold, flattening dust into mud across the construction site and turning the sky into a dull sheet of gray metal. Water pooled along unfinished trenches, reflecting steel beams like broken mirrors. From a distance, the project looked motionless. But inside offices and behind closed doors, things were moving fast. Marcus Bennett noticed the shift immediately. 2 days after filing his report with municipal compliance, he received an unexpected call from Daniel Harper. The tone was different, measured, almost conciliatory. "Richard wants to talk," Daniel said. "He's reconsidering some things." Marcus stood by the window of the site trailer, watching rain strike the gravel below. Reconsidering what? The scope, the materials. He thinks maybe we pushed too aggressively. The words sounded rehearsed. When Marcus entered Redwood's main conference room that afternoon, Richard Coleman stood at the head of the polished oak table, hands folded neatly. His posture was composed, his expression almost regretful. He wore a charcoal suit instead of his usual site jacket, projecting corporate stability. "We've reviewed concerns," Richard began smoothly. "Perhaps adjustments were premature. I value your caution, Marcus." Marcus listened carefully, face unreadable. "We'd like you involved in correcting internal documentation," Richard continued, "to ensure everything aligns properly." Daniel nodded beside him, avoiding direct eye contact. Something inside Marcus tightened. This pivot was too clean. "Aligns with what?" Marcus asked. "With compliance," Richard replied evenly. "We all want the same thing." Marcus agreed to review the documentation. Refusing would appear unreasonable. Over the next week, internal meetings multiplied. Revised files circulated. Procurement summaries were updated. Marcus noticed subtle differences in formatting, in timestamp placements, but nothing overt. Not yet. Meanwhile, across town, Sergeant Thomas Grady sat in a quiet corner booth at a downtown diner. He was 46, heavyset with a thick neck and short-cropped dark hair graying at the temples. His uniform fit snugly over a broad frame that once belonged to a college linebacker. Years on the force had hardened his posture and narrowed his patience. Grady valued order. He valued influence even more. Richard Coleman sat across from him, coffee untouched between them. "This is a minor compliance misunderstanding," Richard said calmly, "but it could become disruptive if misinterpreted." Grady stirred his coffee slowly. "And you're asking?" "Clarity," Richard replied. "Perspective." An envelope changed hands under the table. Grady did not count it. He didn't need to. Back at the site, Marcus received an email from Municipal Compliance stating that his earlier complaint required further internal verification. The language felt oddly delayed. He requested confirmation of receipt. No response came. That afternoon, Richard called another meeting. This time, a procurement manager Marcus had barely interacted with joined them, Harold Finch. Harold was a thin, balding man in his early 40s with nervous eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He spoke quickly, avoided confrontation, and had spent most of his career buried in inventory spreadsheets. He was not ambitious, he was compliant. "Material logs needed adjustment," Harold said, voice tight. "We've streamlined authorization chains." Marcus reviewed the screen. His name appeared repeatedly beside confirmation fields he did not recall approving. "That's not accurate," Marcus said calmly. Daniel leaned forward. It reflects supervisory responsibility. I never signed these, Marcus replied. Richard's expression remained steady. Your credentials authorize review-level oversight. Marcus felt the first true surge of alarm. This was no correction. It was reallocation. 2 days later, a shipment arrived at the warehouse, steel rods labeled within acceptable grade. But Marcus noticed inconsistencies in density markings. He requested inspection documentation. The warehouse supervisor shrugged. Already logged under your clearance. Marcus froze. My clearance. The supervisor nodded. Electronic signature approved. That evening, Marcus attempted to access the authorization log. His login credentials were flagged for review. The trap was tightening. At home, Olivia noticed the change instantly. He was no longer just tired, he was calculating. They're positioning something, he told her quietly. Olivia sat at the kitchen table, hands folded over her stomach. Her strength remained visible, but anxiety traced faint lines across her face now. You reported them, she said softly. If someone inside compliance is compromised. Marcus nodded. Information leaked. The next morning, headlines broke online. Local engineer under review for material irregularities. The article quoted unnamed sources suggesting possible internal authorization discrepancies. Marcus's name appeared before any formal accusation. Across Riverside, whispers began. At Olivia's elementary school, parents lingered longer than usual at classroom doors. Some avoided eye contact. Others exchanged glances that lingered too long. Olivia stood straight, greeting each child with the same warmth as always. But she felt the subtle shift. Reputation moved faster than truth. That afternoon, Emily Ross entered Marcus's trailer pale and shaken. They're building a case, she whispered. I overheard Daniel and Harold discussing liability concentration. They said, your objections make you the obvious link. Marcus's jaw tightened. Do you have anything recorded? Emily hesitated, then nodded slowly. I left my phone recording during the last meeting. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed him a small digital recorder. She had not planned to become part of a corporate conflict, but her conscience had outweighed her fear. You shouldn't be involved further, Marcus told her gently. I already am, she replied. 2 mornings later, municipal officers arrived at the site accompanied by Sergeant Grady. The sky was clear for the first time in days, sunlight glinting harshly off steel beams. Workers stopped mid-motion. Grady approached Marcus directly. His heavy boots left firm impressions in drying mud. Marcus Bennett? Yes. You're under investigation for fraudulent material authorization and regulatory misrepresentation. Richard stood at a distance, expression somber but detached. Daniel avoided Marcus's gaze entirely. Marcus felt the world narrow to a single point. On what basis? Grady produced printed documents. Marcus's electronic signature appeared on procurement orders tied to substandard steel. Revised drainage approvals bore his credential ID. These are falsified, Marcus said calmly. That's for the court to determine, Grady replied. Workers stared in stunned silence. Marcus was escorted from the site. News spread quickly. By evening, local stations ran segments implying intentional misconduct. Samuel Grant watched from his office, brows furrowed. The timing unsettled him. He recognized orchestrated narratives when he saw them. At home, Olivia opened the door to flashing camera lights at the curb. She stood tall, despite the weight of pregnancy shielding her face from microphones. No comment, she said firmly. Her voice did not shake. Marcus was formally suspended by Redwood Development before sunset. By the following morning, charges were filed. Fraud, misrepresentation, technical negligence. Inside the holding area at the municipal building, Marcus sat upright on a metal bench. He did not appear defeated. He appeared analytical. The trap had been set precisely. Responsibility had been transferred quietly. Evidence had been staged convincingly. Narrative had moved ahead of verification. But beneath the surface of accusation, Marcus knew something else remained. He had documentation. He had archived files. He had a recording. Outside, Riverside resumed its ordinary rhythm. Traffic flowing, children walking home from school, the construction site temporarily halted under official seal. The project he had tried to protect now stood still, encircled by caution tape. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. They had not silenced him. They had repositioned him. And the consequences were only beginning. The courthouse in Riverside stood on a slight rise overlooking the older part of town, its sandstone columns weathered by decades of snow and sun. The morning Marcus Bennett walked up its steps. The sky was clear but sharp with winter light. A thin wind moved between the flagpoles, snapping the American flag in steady rhythm. Reporters clustered near the entrance, cameras angled toward the doors, voices low but expectant. Marcus wore a dark navy suit he had owned for years, tailored simply, nothing flashy. His posture was upright, controlled. He carried no briefcase from a high-powered attorney. He carried a single leather folder and a small hard drive. His face showed no panic, only focus. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than it looked from outside. Wooden benches filled gradually with observers, some curious, some skeptical, some already convinced of his guilt. At the prosecution table sat Assistant District Attorney Claire Whitman, a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and steel-gray eyes. She wore her dark hair in a precise bun and spoke with clipped efficiency. Claire was known for her discipline and methodical approach. She believed in systems. She trusted documentation. She had built her career on clean convictions. When the judge entered, Honorable Judge Raymond Keller, a tall man in his early 60s with a calm baritone voice and a measured demeanor, the room rose. Judge Keller had a reputation for patience and intolerance toward theatrics. He listened longer than most, spoke less than most, and valued clarity over spectacle. Marcus had been offered a public defender. He declined. When asked if he wished to proceed without counsel, he answered clearly, "Yes, Your Honor." Murmurs moved through the benches. Claire Whitman studied him with faint curiosity. "Mr. Bennett, you understand the seriousness of these charges?" "I do," Marcus replied. The prosecution began with what looked like a straightforward case. Procurement records bearing Marcus's electronic authorization. Revised foundation approvals attached to his credential, ID. Inspection reports referencing his oversight. Claire moved carefully through each document, projecting confidence. To summarize, she concluded, the defendant authorized substandard materials and misrepresented compliance documentation. Marcus stood when his turn came. He did not rush. He did not dramatize. "Your Honor," he began, "I am not disputing the presence of my credentials on these documents. I am disputing how they got there." He approached the display monitor and connected his drive. "I am a structural engineer. I understand load distribution, material integrity, and digital record systems. Let's begin with physics." He projected a structural model of the Riverside Civic Expansion Foundation. "This is the approved design. Notice the load distribution across the support columns." He clicked to the revised version. "Now compare that to the altered model. The soil compression coefficient was reduced. The external extension increased stress on the retention boundary." Judge Keller leaned forward slightly. Marcus continued. "If I intended to cut corners for profit, I would not have documented repeated objections in internal emails." He displayed printed threads. "These are time-stamped before the alleged approvals." Claire Whitman stood. "Emails can reflect disagreement without proving innocence." "Agreed," Marcus replied calmly. "Which is why we move to material grade." He projected side-by-side images of steel rods. The labeled grade is A36. The density markers show inconsistencies typical of downgraded alloy batches. He displayed lab comparison charts. The tensile strength variance exceeds acceptable tolerance. A murmur passed through the courtroom. Claire narrowed her eyes. "Where did you obtain those test samples?" "From archived procurement deliveries," Marcus replied, "before my access was restricted." He paused, then connected another file. "This is an audio recording from an internal meeting." The courtroom speakers crackled softly. Richard Coleman's voice filled the air, calm, confident. "We shift responsibility downward. If this becomes external, the engineer absorbs impact." Daniel Harper's voice followed, tense but compliant. "He's been vocal. That works in our favor." The room grew still. Claire Whitman's posture shifted. Marcus allowed the recording to finish. "Your Honor," he said, "this is not a misunderstanding, it is premeditation." Claire approached the bench. "We challenge the admissibility." Judge Keller raised a hand. "We will review authenticity before ruling." The afternoon session resumed with new tension in the air. Marcus then displayed surveillance footage from the warehouse loading dock. Grainy, but clear enough to show pallets being swapped after business hours. A timestamp glowed at the bottom corner. "This was recorded at 10:47 p.m., Marcus said. "My system login records show my credentials accessed at 11:02 p.m. remotely." He displayed system logs. The IP address traces to an internal administrative terminal, not my workstation. Claire Whitman flipped through her file, composure thinning. At that moment, Samuel Grant entered the courtroom quietly. He had published an article that morning detailing Redwood Development's prior environmental fine and raising questions about compliance oversight. The article had spread online rapidly. Public perception was shifting. Judge Keller called the next witness, Emily Ross. Emily walked to the stand, shoulders tense but chin lifted. Her slim frame seemed smaller in the formal setting, but her voice steadied as she took the oath. "State your position." "Junior structural engineer, Redwood Development." "Did you observe irregularities?" Claire asked. Emily inhaled. "Yes, I observed late-night edits to soil models and procurement documents inconsistent with standard review protocol." "Did Mr. Bennett instruct those edits?" "No," she said firmly. "He objected repeatedly," Claire pressed. "How do you know?" "Because I saved internal communications and attended meetings." Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes did not waver. Marcus did not look at her while she spoke. He let the truth stand on its own. The defense, if it could be called that, then introduced an independent expert witness, Dr. Alan Mercer. Dr. Mercer was a lean man in his late 50s with silver hair and rectangular glasses, known regionally for forensic structural analysis. His voice carried the quiet authority of decades spent evaluating failures. "I reviewed the engineering data," Dr. Mercer stated calmly. "Mr. Bennett's analysis is accurate. The altered foundation design increased hydrostatic pressure risk. The material downgrade would reduce long-term structural resilience. Furthermore, the digital signature logs show anomalous access patterns inconsistent with normal user behavior." Claire Whitman asked sharply, "In your professional opinion, does the evidence suggest intentional misconduct by Mr. Bennett?" Dr. Mercer answered without hesitation. "No. It suggests he raised legitimate concerns." The room shifted. Judge Keller removed his glasses slowly, regarding the displayed evidence. Claire Whitman's earlier certainty had softened into caution. The clean narrative had fractured. Marcus stood one final time. "I did not seek to damage my employer," he said. "I sought to protect public safety. My signature was used. My objections were documented. My silence was expected." He paused. "But engineering does not bend to expectation." The courtroom sat in silence long enough for the weight of that statement to settle. Judge Keller called for recess. Outside, sunlight reflected sharply off courthouse steps. Reporters recalibrated their headlines. Samuel Grant updated his article in real time, adding verified courtroom developments. Inside, the prosecution's confidence had eroded. The case that once appeared straightforward now held visible cracks. When court reconvened, Claire Whitman requested additional time to review newly presented evidence. Judge Keller's tone remained neutral but firm. The court notes significant inconsistencies requiring further examination. The narrative had shifted. Marcus returned to his seat, not triumphant, not relieved, simply steady. The foundation of accusation had begun to crumble, and for the first time since his arrest, doubt had entered the courtroom, not about him, but about those who framed him. The tide had turned. The final day of trial arrived beneath a bright, almost defiant Colorado sky. Snow lingered faintly along the distant mountain ridges, but Riverside itself stood clear and sharp in winter light. The courthouse steps were crowded long before doors opened. Reporters adjusted microphones. Residents gathered quietly, some out of curiosity, some out of conviction. The air carried that stillness that comes before something irreversible. Inside, the courtroom felt heavier than before, not tense with accusation, but charged with consequence. Richard Coleman sat at the defense table now, no longer composed in the quiet authority he once carried. His tailored suit seemed slightly looser, his posture less commanding. The color had drained from his once confident expression. His pale face looked drawn, and the faint tremor in his clasped hands betrayed a man who understood control had slipped from his grasp. Beside him sat Daniel Harper. Daniel's sandy blonde hair appeared unkempt for the first time, his usual careful presentation undone by sleepless nights. The restless ambition that once fueled him had collapsed into visible anxiety. His shoulders curved inward. He no longer projected forward-thinking strategy. He projected fear. Marcus Bennett entered the courtroom not as a defendant trembling under accusation, but as a man who had endured scrutiny and remained intact. He wore the same navy suit, pressed cleanly. His posture remained upright, steady. His dark eyes scanned the room briefly before he took his seat. He did not look triumphant. He looked patient. Olivia Bennett sat in the second row, hands folded gently over her abdomen, now larger and heavier with the nearing due date. Her caramel-brown skin glowed softly under courtroom lights. Despite the strain of weeks of public scrutiny, she held herself with quiet dignity. Her strength was not loud. It was rooted. She had endured whispers at school, sideways glances from parents, subtle shifts in tone. But she had not bent. Judge Raymond Keller entered with the same measured pace as before. The room rose. He adjusted his glasses and began reviewing findings with calm deliberation. The prosecution had withdrawn several earlier assertions after reviewing forensic digital analysis and financial audit trails. Additional evidence had surfaced. Bank transactions tied to undisclosed consulting fees connected to Redwood Development executives. A forensic accountant named Laura Chen had testified earlier that morning. Laura was in her late 30s, petite with sharp analytical eyes and straight black hair cut at shoulder length. Her demeanor was precise, almost surgical in its clarity. Years working in corporate fraud investigations had sharpened her instinct for hidden patterns. She had traced unusual payments routed through shell consulting firms tied indirectly to Richard Coleman. The money trail painted motive clearly. Now, in closing review, Judge Keller's voice carried steady authority. The court finds sufficient evidence of deliberate misrepresentation of compliance documents, intentional reassignment of digital authorization, and procurement fraud. Richard's jaw tightened. Furthermore, the judge continued, recorded communications demonstrate coordinated intent to shift liability. Daniel's breathing grew shallow. Judge Keller paused briefly, letting silence settle before speaking the words that would redraw the narrative entirely. Richard Coleman and Daniel Harper are hereby found guilty of corporate fraud, financial misconduct, and violation of construction safety regulations. The words did not echo loudly, but they landed with force. Marcus did not move. He simply inhaled once, slow and controlled. Judge Keller then turned his attention toward him. In review of presented evidence, the court finds no proof of fraudulent intent or negligence by Marcus Bennett. On the contrary, documentation shows repeated objections and preventative efforts. He removed his glasses and spoke the line that would later appear in headlines across Riverside. Integrity is not weakness. It is structure. The courtroom fell silent in a different way this time. Not tense, not fractured. Still, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, not in relief alone, but in recognition of what it had cost to reach this moment. Outside, reporters began broadcasting updates immediately. Samuel Grant stood near the courthouse steps, speaking into a handheld recorder. His thin frame looked almost fragile against the bustling crowd, but his voice carried conviction. Today's verdict reinforces the importance of transparency in corporate oversight, he stated. Independent documentation and ethical resistance prevented what could have become both structural and environmental damage. Samuel had spent nights verifying records, cross-referencing municipal archives, and confirming digital timestamps. His article series had exposed inconsistencies that strengthened public scrutiny. That afternoon, an editor from a larger regional paper called to inform him he had been nominated for the Colorado Independent Press Award. He did not celebrate outwardly. He simply nodded once and returned to his notes. Back inside the courthouse, Marcus turned toward Olivia. She rose carefully from the bench and crossed the aisle. For a moment, the noise of the room faded into background blur. She placed a hand on his cheek. "You stood," she said softly. "So did you," he replied. 2 weeks later, Riverside Hospital welcomed new life into the story. Olivia went into labor just before dawn. Snow fell lightly outside the hospital windows, blanketing sidewalks in quiet white. The labor was long, but steady. Marcus remained beside her, holding her hand through each contraction, his composure finally cracking into raw emotion as he heard his son's first cry. They named him Caleb Leonard Bennett. Leonard, after Marcus's father. Caleb was small but strong, dark curls already visible against soft brown skin. His tiny fists opened and closed instinctively as if testing the world he had entered. When Marcus held him for the first time, he felt something settle deeper than victory. He felt legacy. Across town, Bennett's phone began ringing with unexpected calls. One call stood out. It came from Horizon Structural Group, a mid-sized sustainable construction firm based in Denver. The company specialized in environmentally compliant projects and ethical oversight audits. Its founder, Michael Alvarez, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with warm olive skin and steady dark eyes, had followed the trial closely. Michael had built his firm after leaving a larger corporation over ethical disagreements years earlier. He believed profitability and responsibility were not mutually exclusive. His voice over the phone carried respect. "We need someone who doesn't bend," Michael said plainly. "I think you've proven you don't." Marcus listened quietly. "We'd like to offer you a senior oversight position," Michael continued, "not just as an engineer, but as a compliance leader." Marcus did not answer immediately. He looked down at Caleb sleeping against his chest. "I'll consider it," he said finally. In Riverside, public opinion shifted quickly once the verdict spread. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact now offered congratulations. Parents at Olivia's school approached her with apologies, some sincere, some awkward. Redwood Development issued a brief statement acknowledging internal failures. Investors distanced themselves from former leadership. The Riverside Civic Expansion site remained halted pending structural reassessment. Marcus returned to the site one final time before formal closure. Snow dusted the steel beams lightly. Caution tape fluttered in the cold wind. He stood near the original permit line, boots pressing into frozen ground. He thought of the 12 feet. He thought of the cost of standing still when pressured to step forward blindly. And he understood something with clarity. Structures fail when shortcuts become normal. Communities fail when silence becomes safety. He turned away from the unfinished foundation, not as a defeated employee, but as a man whose name had been restored. Back at home, Olivia placed Caleb gently in his crib. The house felt different now, not quieter but fuller. Marcus stood at the window watching snow gather along the sidewalk. He felt no anger, no desire for retaliation, only alignment. He had walked into a storm. He had not collapsed. And as Riverside settled into winter evening, one truth stood firm above the noise, above the headlines, above the doubt that once surrounded him. Integrity was not weakness. It was structure. Spring arrived in Riverside slowly, as if the city itself needed time to exhale after a long winter. Snowmelt streamed gently along the riverbanks, carrying with it the last reminders of cold months past. The mountains still held streaks of white at their peaks, but downtown sidewalks warmed beneath golden sunlight. Construction cranes returned to motion in cautious rhythm. Riverside was building again, but differently. Marcus Bennett stood in a modest rented office space overlooking Main Street, sunlight stretching across hardwood floors that still smelled faintly of fresh varnish. The sign on the frosted glass door read, "Bennett Structural Consulting." The letters were simple, clean, intentional. Marcus had declined several corporate offers before making this decision. Horizon Structural Group had been generous. Other firms had reached out as well, some motivated by genuine respect, others by public relations opportunity. But Marcus had realized something important during the trial. Oversight must be independent to be trusted. He wanted to build something that answered not to shareholders first, but to safety. The office was not large. A reception desk stood near the entrance. A drafting table rested by the window. Blueprints were rolled neatly along one wall. Framed on another was his engineering license, restored without blemish. Olivia Bennett stepped inside carrying Caleb, now 4 months old. Spring light softened her features. She wore a light cream cardigan over a simple dress, her curls tied loosely behind her head. Motherhood had changed her posture slightly, gentler in movement, firmer in resolve. The weeks following Caleb's birth had been sleepless but steady. The stress of the trial had left shadows, but those shadows no longer defined her. "You're officially open," she said with a small smile. Marcus adjusted a stack of documents. "Officially accountable," he corrected gently. Caleb stirred in her arms, tiny fingers grasping at the air. His dark eyes were wide and observant. He had inherited Marcus's calm gaze. Marcus leaned down and pressed his forehead lightly against his son's. For him, this office was more than business. It was promise. The first contract Bennett Structural Consulting accepted was not large. A mid-sized residential complex seeking third-party structural review. Marcus approached it with the same precision he once applied at Redwood, but now with full autonomy. Soon after, the Riverside Civic Expansion project resumed under new oversight. The city appointed an independent compliance committee to reassess every foundation element. Marcus was invited, not as an employee, but as a consultant. The site looked different when he returned. The earlier steel had been removed. Drainage channels were re-excavated to original specifications. Environmental buffer zones were reinforced with sustainable runoff barriers. Standing beside him was City Planning Director Karen Whitfield. Karen was a tall woman in her mid-40s with sharp cheekbones and focused brown eyes. She wore her dark hair in a professional bun and carried a clipboard tucked beneath her arm. Years earlier, She had nearly lost her position after exposing zoning irregularities in another district. That experience had hardened her belief in transparent oversight. "We should have caught this sooner," she admitted quietly as they reviewed corrected plans. Marcus shook his head. "Systems are only as strong as the people maintaining them." Karen nodded slowly. "Then we maintain them better." Across town, Marcus's name began appearing on university event flyers. Guest lecture, Ethical Engineering and Structural Accountability. Speaker, Marcus Bennett. Founder, Bennett Structural Consulting. The first lecture took place at Colorado State University's College of Engineering. The auditorium filled steadily with students, some curious about the legal battle, others drawn by the ethical debate. Marcus stood at the podium wearing a simple charcoal suit, no dramatic slides behind him. His voice carried steady confidence. He did not begin with his trial. He began with soil composition. He explained hydrostatic pressure. He demonstrated load diagrams. He walked through failure scenarios that could have occurred. Only after grounding the lecture in engineering fundamentals did he shift. "Design errors can collapse buildings," he said, "but ethical errors collapse trust." In the front row sat a student named Jacob Miller, a tall, broad-shouldered sophomore with close-cropped hair and intense blue eyes. Jacob had grown up believing engineering was purely technical. That lecture reshaped him. When the Q&A session opened, a student in the back raised her hand. "Did you ever feel like giving up?" she asked. Marcus paused briefly. "Yes," he answered honestly, "but quitting would have made the structure weaker." The room grew quiet. Then he spoke the words that would echo beyond the lecture hall. "Concrete holds buildings. Character holds lives." Applause followed. Not loud and explosive, but sustained and thoughtful. Over the following months, Marcus became something he never intended to be, a symbol. Local news outlets framed him as an example of professional courage. Community panels invited him to speak about regulatory reform. Parents who once avoided Olivia now introduced their children proudly, explaining, "That's the engineer who stood up." Samuel Grant published a final piece in his investigative series titled The Cost of Silence. The article focused not on scandal, but on reform. It highlighted new municipal review processes implemented after the case. It credited independent oversight as essential to civic integrity. When Samuel later received the Colorado Independent Press Award nomination officially, he called Marcus. "You didn't just protect a building," Samuel said. "You protected the idea that truth still matters." Marcus replied simply, "We all did." Summer arrived warm and bright. The Riverside Civic Expansion Project reached completion nearly a year after its halt. The foundation now aligned exactly with approved permits. Drainage systems were reinforced. Environmental inspection reports cleared the project fully. On the evening of its official unveiling, the city hosted a modest ribbon-cutting ceremony. No corporate extravagance. No inflated promises. Marcus stood at a distance rather than center stage. He preferred it that way. Olivia stood beside him, Caleb in her arms, now steady enough to sit upright and observe the world with curiosity. The sunset painted the sky in layers of orange and soft violet. Steel beams glowed briefly before fading into shadow. Karen Whitfield addressed the small crowd. "This structure stands not just because it was engineered correctly, but because someone refused to compromise." She gestured toward Marcus. He stepped forward reluctantly. There were no grand speeches prepared, no rehearsed declarations. He looked at the finished building. Clean lines, stable base, protected surroundings. Then he looked at his family. "People once assumed my resistance was about pride," he said quietly. "It wasn't. It was about responsibility." He let his gaze sweep across the gathered crowd. Faces of different backgrounds, ages, races. "It's not the color of your skin that determines your strength," he continued. "It's the choices you make when pressure tests you." He paused briefly. Concrete holds buildings. Character holds lives. The words settled gently in the warm evening air. Caleb reached out with one small hand, grasping at nothing and everything at once. Marcus placed his arm around Olivia's shoulders. She leaned into him. The sun dipped fully behind the horizon, leaving the finished structure illuminated under newly installed lights. Steady, legal, safe, not built on shortcuts, not built on silence, built on structure. And in that fading light, as Riverside moved forward with clearer foundations and stronger oversight, one truth stood undeniable. It was never about color. It was about conscience. And conscience, when anchored firmly, could hold more weight than steel. Final lesson. This story reminds us that integrity is rarely tested when life is comfortable. It is tested when staying silent is easier, when compromise looks profitable, and when standing alone feels dangerous. Marcus did not win because he was stronger than everyone else. He won because he refused to let fear shape his choices. In everyday life, we may not face a courtroom or a corporate conspiracy, but we face smaller versions of the same test. At work, when we see something wrong and pretend not to notice. In school, when we allow cheating because it is convenient. In our communities, when we judge someone by appearance instead of character. Integrity is not loud. It is quiet consistency. It is doing the right thing when no one applauds. It is protecting others even when it costs you. The story also teaches us that racial prejudice weakens society the same way corruption weakens a building. When we measure people by skin color instead of values, we damage the very foundation of trust that holds communities together. Character has no color. Courage has no race. Responsibility belongs to all of us. In your daily life, ask yourself simple questions. Am I honest when no one is watching? Do I speak up when something is wrong? Do I treat others with dignity regardless of background? These small decisions shape families, workplaces, and entire cities. Let this story challenge you gently. Build your life the way a strong engineer builds a foundation. Carefully, transparently, with long-term vision. Teach your children that reputation is earned through action. Teach your friends that silence is not always peace. If this message moved you, share this story with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what integrity means in your life. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that strengthen character and inspire courage. May God bless you and your family with wisdom, protection, and strength to stand firm when it matters most. If you believe that conscience is stronger than fear and character is stronger than prejudice, write Amen in the comments.